All right, we are live. Friends, welcome. This is going to be quite an exciting and interesting talk, especially for the religious nerds amongst us, which is who I take it here tonight. I am fascinated with this material on a lot of levels. One, because it's a theologian that we're discussing that I haven't done as much reading as I've always wanted to, but a book of his was gifted to me after the first wedding I did, which was for two college friends. One who was one who was Jewish and one who was Presbyterian, and it was just a fascinating interfaith experience as a first wedding to offer, and I really appreciated that gift that they gave me. But tonight we have our friend and neighbor from Mishkan, Israel, Rabbi Dennis Ross, who is the intentional interim, as we were just joking about before we started the camera, at Mishkan, Israel. And only has 2-3 months left. Two, which is heartbreaking on one front for me, because I've really enjoyed getting to know him through our interfaith conversations that we've been having, and the congregation has heard some about revolving Hamden Town Council's ceasefire resolution, which some of that may come up at some point tonight. But Rabbi Dennis Ross is the author of the newly published A Year with Martin Buber, Wisdom from the Weekly Torah portion. It will describe how the teachings of the great 20th century Jewish thinker Martin Buber bring us to spirituality in the daily routine through the I-thou relationship. He's also the author of a whole bunch of other books, was recognized as a top 10 book of the year by the Academy of Parish Clergy. He's also written God in Our Relationships, Spirituality Between People, from the teachings of Martin Buber, When a Lie is Not a Sin, All Politics is Religious, which I think that also would be a fascinating talk to invite you for, given the time and seasons that we are in. He holds a Master of Social Work. My wife is a social worker. Yeah. And is on his way to Bedford, New York next after his term ends here. Yes, I think that's, he also, we were talking about before another session I'd love to have him come for, is a discussion of clergy for choice, because that is a voice that often gets overlooked and minimized and erased in the way that American politics positions pro-choice as antithetical to religious life, which is definitely not our viewpoint in a lot of ways. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rabbi Ross here.
Thank you.
To give us an interesting talk.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those kind words, Reverend Davidson. Am I loud enough if anybody's logged in?
Yes, yeah. That's
okay, great. So, yeah, I want to thank you for those kind words. Lots of times you'll hear people say something like, all you really need to do in life is just show up. And sometimes they'll say it's 80%, 90%. Maybe they'll do a study and come up with an exact number of what. But you see, Buber is about being present, and saying in Hebrew, hineni. If you've heard that phrase, that's what Moses said when he saw the burning bush, or how Abraham responded when he was called to offer up Isaac. There must be something in your scriptures, the equivalent of hineni, but this is how
we just steal it from you.
You just steal it.
Our favorite hymn is "Here I Am, Lord."
Yeah, and then we steal it back, and adjust it a little. And we say, no, it's not that.
Yeah.
But being present is something you live. Living hineni is something you do, as here in the community, talking one-to-one, and with your congregation. So it's really a privilege and pleasure for me to be here with you and your community, and talk about Martin Buber, which is something Reverend Davidson lives instinctively. You'll hear how we talk about it. So I can tell you that a long time before there was a Starbucks, there was a coffee shop in Haight-Ashbury, California, called San Francisco called I and Thou. And it probably got the name I and Thou from the kind of conversation that the owners of that coffee shop hoped the people who came there have. It's sort of like the best video. It was the best video. Yeah, the best video of San Francisco. Yeah. So let's imagine you and I, we meet there. We grab a cup and sit down, and we get so, we're so excited to be having this meeting that as we talk, we forget about time, how long we're talking, space, where we are, right? We pay no attention to people coming and going or the atmosphere in the room, and cause what brought us there to be together for that moment. Now, if Jewish thinker Martin Buber was sitting at the next table, he would likely say that we were living out, our conversation was living out an example of what he wrote about in his 1923 classic of spirituality, I and Thou. In that book, I and Thou, that's probably the one you got for that wedding, for that wedding. In that book, I and Thou, Buber lays out three fundamentals. There's the I-it relationship, which could be when you go over and you place your order, and the person says, "What are you having?" All right, leave room for milk. Where you get it? That's I-it. That's the first. Where it's a business thing, right? I-thou is a conversation we have at the table, and all this is on the sheet that I gave out, because there are a lot of these terms that I'm going to be throwing around, and you could at least have it right there. And the eternal thou, where every I thou, this is a spiritual dimension. You can't see it, but you can sort of feel it. It's the spiritual dimension that of the conversation that we're having. Buber basically said every I thou abides with God in the eternal thou forever. And there's a little bit of Kabbalah in here, Shirley. If you think of Stan, right? It's with the invisible dimension of God that we just can't see. But when we have that conversation, that conversation echoes with God in the eternal thou. Now, I and Thou is a really hard read. I should have brought my copy, but it's a very hard read. And if it makes you feel any better, if you read it, the first time I read it, I didn't understand it either. Like many late 19th and early 20th century writers, Buber took the simplest idea and try to make it sound as complicated as possible. He wrote plus I'm told, I don't know any German, but I'm told he wrote in German, and he used run-on sentences, which is allowed, and also he made up his own words, which I'm told people who speak German tell me you're allowed to do that. So as a result, even in the best translations, it's hard to figure out what he's saying, because in German, nobody, now, but the reason why he did this was he wrote in Germany in 1923, which was a time of rising anti-Semitism, especially in academic circles. Mm-hmm. So he wanted to make Jewish ideas presentable and more accessible and acceptable in these intellectual circles. That was his target audience. He also joked about it. He said that when in 1938, as the Nazis rose and were in power, just a few months before Kristallnacht, which was the big pogrom against Jews in 1938, he and his family completed their move to Israel, to Jerusalem. And when he got there, this is a legend, I don't know if it's true, but when he got there, someone asked him if he would begin to write in Hebrew, and he said, "I don't think I know Hebrew well enough to obscure my ideas in it." So, yeah, a guy with a sense of humor like that. Also, when he came to the United States, he took 3 trips to the United States, one in 1951, and his friend Gershon Shalom wrote from Jerusalem, wrote Hannah Arendt that he had heard that since Pepsi Cola hit America, it was nothing like Buber, and he asked Arendt whether Buber already succeeded making himself incomprehensible. So he was, at a time when people were doing this, he really he really went to town on it. And as a result, his ideas, really simple but brilliant ideas, just stayed on library shelves and in seminary classrooms unappreciated. So that gave me an opportunity, and this is my social work piece. You see, the spirituality in the process. That's what Buber is about. Because as a social worker and a rabbi, gave me an opportunity to try to explain to what it is through my own writing. So I wrote. So anyway, I did. Because I was really drawn. First of all, I thou hides in plain sight. We do it instinctively every day. It could be at the supermarket cash register, or it could be over lunch with a friend. Be the simple or the more involved conversations count as the I thou encounter. So when we call attention to like a spirituality hiding in plain sight, I mean, it's right there. All we got to do is say, "Hey, this is it." So it's common. It's also very simple. You don't need a degree in philosophy to understand what Buber's saying, because we live it in our daily lives. The other thing is the interpersonal piece of this comes from the Hebrew Bible in a very profound way, because when the Bible commands us in Deuteronomy to love the eternal your God with all your heart, might, and soul. And how do we show our love for God? Well, there are two other times the Bible commands us to love. The first time is to love your neighbor in Leviticus, and also to love the stranger. So when we love the neighbor and we love the stranger, we show our love for God at the same time in the eternal thou. That's Buber. So it's that clear. And again, there's I wanted to make it clear, show how common it is in our daily lives, and find that spirituality in the process. Excuse me, really important to me. So when I wrote my first book on Buber, God and Our Relationships, first I had a little introduction. I explained I thou, then I explained I it, and the editor said, no, talk about I it first. And when I told my wife this, she said, yeah, your editor's right. So I said, oh, it's got to be. It's got to be. So let's talk about I it first. And you see, it builds a little tension or traction. I mean, the I it, the person is a means to an end. They're not an end in and of themselves, as they are in the I thou. So a person is a tool to the goal I want to achieve, to the job I want to do. I'm in an apartment building in New Haven. I rent a small apartment, and my door knob came off basically as I was leaving this morning. I said, "How am I going to get in?" So I went down to the concierge and I said, my door knob came off. The handle came off. Can you send somebody up? And she said, all right, types it in. Goodbye. Right. So this I it is business. It's the person that I'm talking to is a tool for me to get back into my apartment when I come home tonight. Another sign of I thou, that they're a tool to a goal, in addition to that, is that I it, is that the I it exchange is timed, paid, and measured. You ever go into Costco and you see they have the number of items people scan per hour? They have a chart. I don't know if you saw that. No, that's I it. That's all you're worth. Go to the doctor. Maybe you get a very impersonal nurse who says, your blood pressure is high, it's low. You're a number. That's really, this is I it. Now, so I it is basically analysis, diagnosis, and treatment as well. So like if, let's say I got a stuffed drain, I call the plumber. The plumber analyzes it. He said, you got a stuffed drain. It says, oh, you got a stuffed drain. Diagnosis, I got to snake it. and the diagnosis. Well, anyway, there's stuff in there you can't get out. The treatment, oh, I got a snake and it's $1,000, right? That's what, but that's what the IIT is. We also see a bad case of IIT with a lot of our with many of our kids in school with grades and class rank and grade point average and competition, sports. It can, we have it there as well. But let's not forget that the IIT is often good. For instance, I want to get into my apartment later. I want to get my drain unstuffed. I don't have that problem there. But if my blood pressure is high or low, I want to do something about it so I don't get sick. So it isn't necessarily bad. In fact, it's good because we need it to survive. The goal is to bring a little bit of I thou into the I it. So, for instance, if let's say you go to your doctor, and the doctor belongs to the church here, and so you're in the office, and the first 2 minutes you spend talking about the great sermon Reverend Davidson gave on Sunday, right? That's I thou. But then you talk about the pain in your elbow. That's I it. But it's a richer I it because there's something of a relationship that you bring into the business side of the conversation. This comes out of Judaism. It may be a little obtuse, but there's a ceremony we have at the end of the Sabbath called Havdalah, when we bring some of the sweetness of the Sabbath day of rest into the secular time of the week. So we bring some of the sweetness of that heart-to-heart conversation, about a common or routine thing. We bring that I thou into the I it, and that enriches it the tiniest bit. So that's an important thing we try to do. I it, though, can become bad. Sometimes the term, I don't think Buber used this term himself, reification, where the smallest part of the person swells up and defines the entire person. Now, sometimes this is good. For instance, if I'm in a car accident and I need an ambulance, and they show up, the EMTs show up with the uniforms and the badge, and I say, "Oh, help is here." It's not the person; it's the uniform. You see, the uniform defines the entire person. So in that case, the reification is a positive thing, but it can become bad when we categorize people and treat them poorly because of their race, because of their age, because of their country of origin, where they were born, or the language they speak, or the accent they have. So it can become bad. It's important for Buber to avoid labeling people on the basis of these differences. Now, look, maybe living here, you can be a Yankee or a Met fan or a Red Sox fan, and I see both day in and day out, and that's okay. It's when it gets out of hand, you see, and it's occasionally you sometimes people get carried away with that. But Buber avoided labels, and before he moved to Israel and under the Nazis, there was a time where they were coming or going from house to house and business to business and putting signs in people's windows describing what they do for a living. So the Nazis came, the SS came to Buber's house and asked him what he does for a living because they want to put a sign in the window. And Buber says to this SS guy, "I don't believe in labels. You can put up whatever sign you want." So the guy looks around his house and he sees Buber had an extensive library of maybe 10, 15,000 books, I've read by some estimates. So the Nazi's looking around and he says, "All right, bookseller." He puts the sign in the window. And Buber just didn't care what label they imposed on him. And so that's the ayat side. To sum up, it could be bad, it could be good, but you see, God put us in this world to partake of the good in it, and to work on it and make it better and improve it. A lot of this is it, and that's okay. It's in fact a very good. When God created the world in Genesis, God said, "This is good." Right? It's not relational, but the trees and the animals and the charge to be responsible stewards of the earth and partake of it responsibly. This is all good. It's when we get carried away and lose perspective that it turns out to be a bad. So that's it. I thou, where we see it is a person is an end, is a means to an end. In I thou, the person is an end in and of themselves. So that's pretty pretty straightforward. It's hard. We're really not supposed to define I thou or analyze it, because when we do, we take it apart and it becomes it. So by definition, you can't really talk about it. But I'm going to do it anyway because that's what we're here for. Now, the first point is that Buber took a holistic view of the person. Freud had, your psyche had three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. That wasn't it for Buber. It was the whole person, everything at once. Sort of like Carl Rogers in psychotherapy, if you're familiar with his work. He and Buber actually had a open dialogue in the 50s. It's the transcript is written down in a wonderful book, and it's worth a read if you're curious about it. But the point is, Buber rejected reductionism, and when Freud wrote, he was so upset with Freud, and the two never, even though they lived in Germany, never met, or if they met, they didn't. There's nothing written about any conversations they had. And Buber traveled in these circles. Freud wrote this book, his book Moses and Monotheism, where he provides a historic analysis of the Bible that really upset Buber. With God, the superego, really upset Buber. He went off and wrote his book Moses to set the record straight. Imagine, Buber wrote like 24 books. Imagine being so smart that when you get upset about something, you go off and write a scholarly book, no less. Was Buber's Moses, but so Buber had a holistic view of the person and didn't pick us apart. So that's one thing about I thou, that I talk to you as a thou, and you talk to me as a thou, and that's what makes it work. The signs of the I thou relationship: time, space, and cause. We talked about those a moment ago. How long we're talking. You look at your watch and say, "Oh my goodness, I didn't realize we were at it." For such a long time. Also, there's a sense of timelessness while we're in the I thou, that we just lose track of the time, and we're not aware of time as it's going by. Space, where we are, could be on a train moving and talking to somebody. It passes out of awareness. Also, the stuff going on around us in the restaurant, people moving. The server maybe comes over, fills up your water glass, distracts the conversation for half a second. You go, that's it. Then you go right back into it. And I thou, it can be that flip flop. But the space, what's going on around us, is not a factor. And cause, what brought me here? I take a cab or a bus, or did I walk where I'm going later? No, all that is out of awareness, because our focus is on you and me, what we're talking about right now. That we're just so caught up in the moment, something like a trance or an enchantment with each other as we're having this conversation. Now, a few very important things is that the I thou conversation or encounter is between people. Buber didn't always look at it this way. He was very involved in the early Zionist movement with Theodor Herzl and the other early 19th century Zionists. And he had a terrible falling out with Herzl. Buber was an idealist. Herzl was a politician. Herzl, again, was the lead Zionist organizer in those days in Europe. And the two of them had a terrible falling out. And Buber stopped his Jewish activism and went into a period of study and meditation and reflection and exploring Eastern religions. And he was home one day, and he heard a knock on his door. This was during World War I, and it turned out to be some guy he never met before, but he asked him in. And like many others who came to see Buber, they would present a problem that they were facing to him and ask for his advice. So the guy talked, and Buber listened, but not wholeheartedly. It was like this, and he didn't have. He was just so caught up in what he was meditating earlier, and he just was still carried by the afterglow of his session, and he wasn't fully present. He withheld his curiosity, and his visitor left with his questions unanswered. A few months later, Buber learned that this fellow died at the front in World War I, and like any of us, he blamed himself for the whole thing. He said, if I was more involved, if I asked a couple of questions, maybe it would have made a difference, and maybe he would be here and be alive today. So, and this is, you have with these intellectuals, you often hear a story that was a turning point for their spiritual or intellectual or emotional development, and this is the one that we tell about Buber. That out of this, Buber learned the I thou is not in the I or in the thou, but in the dash between them. You see how it's written out on that sheet of paper. That what passes between us, there's something magical in the air, and that it was visible in behavior, not in how we feel. I could say, oh, I thought of you yesterday. I almost called. That doesn't count. You got to pick up the phone. It's got to be in the action. Which sort of resonates with the Jewish concept of mitzvah, that it's in the doing and in something active. Viktor Frankl, one of Buber's contemporaries, said that the door to the spirit opens outward, not inward, but outward, and that was a conclusion that Buber came to from this incident, and that our spiritual experience isn't in isolation, but with other people. Another important point here is that it's a mutual relationship. It's not the power, the investment of person and presence is equal for both parties. Both people have an equal stake in the conversation. For instance, an unequal relationship is generally speaking, between a teacher and a student. The first day of class, the student walks in, what am I going to learn here? The teacher knows what the student doesn't know and where the student has to be. Plus, the teacher grades the student, is paid to be in the room, is regulated by laws and supervised and is accountable. So it's really an I-it relationship at heart, but there are times where the I-thou can poke through. When you have a teacher who's talks to a student about what you did over the vacation, or more visibly in college, like where a student and an instructor can have a conversation on the same level. It's quite possible. Another example is in psychotherapy, where the client barely has any insight into themselves. I mean, I'm overstating, but that's what you have, where the counselor not only knows where the client has to go and where the client is, but is able to monitor their own feelings in relationship in those moments. So now, when Buber had this dialogue with Carl Rogers, they agreed that the effective moment of psychotherapy is where both sides have equal insight into themselves and into the other in that moment. As an example of this mutuality, we'll get to that in a minute. Often people question this. Buber in I and Thou wrote about an encounter with a cat, and in his biography, he wrote about he had these biographical fragments. He went into a shed and he was with a horse, and they looked in the eye. Earlier on in his life, he felt you could have that with an animal. Later on, he didn't write about it as much, but I think he distanced himself, and I think it was over the idea of the mutuality and the reciprocity in the relationship. this is part of a term he uses, inclusion, or imagine the real. Robert J. Lifton uses this term, imagine the real, that you never really can know what the next person is experiencing, but you can try to imagine it. So I remember the first lesson we learned in pastoral care, never say to somebody, I know exactly how you feel, right? Because we don't know exactly how a person feels. We can try to imagine it. It's real, but I don't know what's going on inside of you. I can't precisely feel your pain. I can say, an example Buber gives is to see both sides. He said, put your hand on my arm, then feel my arm under your hand, then try to imagine what my arm feels like under your hand, all at the same time. Hold on to your perception and hold on to mine. So now we're getting into the dialogue that we were having right in this room. A very moment, very difficult dialogue. Trying, there are people coming from different backgrounds, trying to imagine what the next person is living with. And a term that Buber used in I and Thou is will and grace. And if you remember the TV series, they got the name, they admitted that we got this name from Buber because you can't, if you have teenagers at home or kids at home, really, you can't will a relationship. It happens by grace. So, for instance, if you have this kid at home and you say, what happened in school? Well, nothing. What do you mean nothing happened? They come home and nothing happened. And so they go upstairs, and then you have a meeting, or you want to go to the church to hear somebody talk about Buber or some other. And just as you're ready to leave, you want to get there on time, the kid wants to talk, right? You ever have that? So you see, the I-thou happens by grace. You can't will it. It has to happen by itself. If somebody wants it, it'll be. If both people want it, and by grace also, this is God's grace to us, that we're able to relate in such a way with one another and enhance our lives in that way. And look, Buber didn't write about gender orientation or expression or identity, but it's the same thing with our gender. That is, we can't will a gender, and our sexuality happens to us by grace. This is a gift that we get, which is where I think they got. I think that's the connection in the producers' minds. I know they admitted that link to Buber, owned it, but didn't really explain it. So coming to we're racing. Well, we're getting to our final thoughts, but another term Buber uses is holy insecurity. That are the sense of spirituality and the sacred isn't secure. Lots of times when we think of spirituality, it's peace of mind, but not to Buber. It's having a good fight, having a good argument, and putting yourself on the line and risking your opinions, as we did in that dialogue here, risking oneself, one's standing, one's position in the community by holding a position and expressing it in having an open conversation. Buber got to this idea as a little kid. When he was 3, his mother, he was living in Vienna with his mother and father. And when he was 3, his mother upped and left. She ran off to Russia with a guy. And he never got a word of explanation or any idea of when he'll ever see her again. He longed for her every day, as any 3-year-old might. He went off to live with his grandparents. His father didn't raise him himself. He lived with his grandparents, where they, we were talking about languages before. His grandfather was a scholar of Midrash, Jewish folklore, and his grandmother ran the business, some sprawling farm and mining in business, and they were very well to do. And she got tutors for Martin, so he was home all day by himself, but learning with tutors. His grandparents were out one day, and he was about 5, and he was left with a babysitter, 12-year-old babysitter. And he remembers leaning on a railing, and somehow the topic of his mother came up, and the babysitter said to him, "No, she will never come back." And that's the first time anyone said that to him. And those words clung to his soul. And he later wrote, if I can find it, yeah, it's right here. He later wrote, "I suppose all I have learned about genuine meaning in the course of my life had its first origins in that hour on the balcony. The no, she will never come back. That every I thou has to end. It's built into the beginning. And being able to say goodbye and have those endings in a positive way is critical to our spiritual and emotional development." In I and Thou, Buber wrote about this. He said, "It's the exalted melancholy of our fate." Exalted because the I Thou, I get something to drink. The I Thou, I get it. The I Thou encounter is holy. Melancholy because it's sad, and fated because it's got to be, right? So the exalted melancholy of our fate was a really profound insight that Buber gives us about relationship and life. So we're coming to the end. The next term I'd like to share with you is Hebrew humanism. That is a love for people, a universal love for people coming out of the Hebrew Bible. Out of there, we get it really deeply rooted in the self. But you see, that little conversation we have in the coffee house is more than just two people talking. But because Buber wanted each of these I-thou encounters to radiate outward into a human community where there's open discussion about things that divide us. That all these I-thous add up and radiate out into a society that's built on equality and inclusion. Buber, as I said, moved to Israel in 1938. He had a vision of Israel. This is where he differed with Herzl, a vision of an inclusive Israel, and built on biblical humanistic values. He fell in love with the kibbutz movement, although he didn't live on a kibbutz ever. He was an intellectual, but he did work. He believed in a binational state of Jews and Arabs working together in those days, and he belonged to organizations that supported that, and that was a lifelong commitment of his. And during the 1948 War of Israel's independence, he was living in a mixed Arab-Jewish neighborhood, and he had relationships with his Arab neighbors. And some of them were very devoted to him. The neighborhood, he lived in Abu Tor in Jerusalem. I don't know if you're familiar with the neighborhood, but his house, during the 48 War, he had to evacuate his house because that land eventually went to Jordan. And his home, his neighborhood was being invaded, and one of his Arab neighbors stood at the door and said, when the Iraqi troops came to plunder his house, they said, "You can't violate this house. Professor Buber lives here, and I'm not going to let you in." So this neighbor put his life on the line on behalf of Buber, and eventually Buber relocated to another neighborhood in Jerusalem. But that was the kind of relationship he had and wanted between Arabs and Jews in the land of Israel. So here we have a vision of individual conversations. We have a vision for a society built on Hebrew humanism. And it's all nice social work, right, of relational living. So again, the spirituality and the relationship has to do with the eternal thou. That all of these I-thou encounters encounter God at the same time in the eternal thou, where they abide forever. So here's that spiritual dimension of Buber's work. That's basically what we've got with Martin Buber. The I thou, the I it, and especially for the I thou, that we show our love for God when we show our love for our neighbors, when we show our love for the stranger, and through those encounters, we enter a spiritual dimension that Buber gives us called the eternal thou. So that's his 24 books, and I don't know how long. How many articles? Yeah. How many articles? He spoke so many languages. I thought we could take time for conversation. I did want to turn off the live stream. If anybody's watching now, I want to keep this conversation in the room. I think people will be easier to talk.
We'll go from the I it section to the I
Yeah.
Section.
Hopefully,
yes. Thank you to those for joining us online. Those in person, we'll take 5 seconds while I close up the
thank you.
The live stream, and let's just first give a round of applause. Thank you. I feel like we just got like a semester's worth of knowledge in a brief talk. So well done. You took what you said was a very complicated book and made it very digestible. So thank you so much. Take a minute and get some refreshments if you didn't get to earlier. And for those of you online, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah.